She didn't know that the worst night of her life would also be the night she stopped being invisible. Harper Quinn had spent 3 years disappearing inside this mansion, ducking into service corridors, pressing her back against walls when the family passed, making herself small enough that no one had reason to look twice. She was good at it. She'd had to be. But tonight, inside the conservatory, with Evelyn Blackthorne shaking like a leaf in December wind and Isabella DeLuca's ring cutting toward the old woman's face, tonight, Harper's body moved before her brain could talk her out of it. She stepped in front of it. The diamond edge opened her cheek like a letter. The pain was white and absolute. And then she heard footsteps on marble, and the conservatory door swung open, and Adrian Blackthorne walked in. And the look on his face told her that nothing, not a single thing, would ever be the same again. If you're new here, like the video, drop your city in the comments, and stay with me until the very end, because this story is only getting started. The morning Harper Quinn arrived at Blackthorne Estate for the first time, she spilled coffee on herself getting off the bus. It wasn't symbolic. It wasn't a sign. It was just a Tuesday in November, and the thermos she'd bought at the dollar store had a lid that never sealed right, and she'd been rushing because the second bus in the sequence always ran 4 minutes early, and if she missed it, she'd have to wait 40 minutes in the cold, which would make her late, which would give Mrs. Aldridge, the estate's head of household staff, a reason to cut her first week's pay. So she rushed. She spilled. She stood on the sidewalk outside the estate's service entrance with a dark stain spreading across the front of her white blouse, her heart doing that tight, panicked thing it did whenever anything went even slightly wrong. She stood there for a moment, breathing through her nose. Then she pulled her coat shut over the stain and walked in anyway. That was how Harper Quinn operated. Not gracefully, not confidently, not the way the other women in the staff seemed to move. Women who were slim and carefully groomed and who wore their uniforms like they'd been tailored to fit. She operated by brute forward motion, by keeping her head down and her feet moving, by telling herself that the paycheck at the end of the week was worth it, because the paycheck at the end of the week went directly to Mercy General Hospital's billing department, and Mercy General was where her father lay in a bed on the 4th floor with tubes running in and out of him, and a doctor who had told her, in that terrible gentle way doctors had, that without the continued treatment schedule they'd established, the timeline would shorten considerably. Harper was 27 years old, and she was keeping a man alive with her embarrassment. So she walked in with coffee on her shirt. Mrs. Aldridge noticed immediately. The woman was 62, thin as a fence post, and possessed of the particular cruelty that belonged to people who had once been powerless and who had clawed their way into small authority. She looked at Harper's stain the way you'd look at something you'd found on the bottom of your shoe, and she said, without preamble, "That is not how we present ourselves in this household." "I know," Harper said. "I'm sorry, I have a spare blouse in my bag." "Why do you have a spare blouse in your bag?" "I spill things." The silence was perfectly awful. 3 other maids standing nearby, Caroline, Priya, and a woman everyone called Dex, though her name badge read Dextra, all found reasons to look at something else, not out of sympathy, out of the instinct that small cruelties are more enjoyable when the target has no allies. "Change it," Mrs. Aldridge said, "then report to the West Wing." Harper changed it. She reported to the West Wing. She did not cry until the service bathroom at the end of her shift, with both taps running to cover the sound, and even then, it was more exhaustion than anything else. Crying meant something was getting to her. Harper had learned over the past year and a half of bills and waiting rooms and the particular specific grief of watching someone you loved diminish slowly that crying was expensive. It cost energy she didn't have. So she kept it brief, washed her face, and took the bus home. She came back the next day. She came back the day after that. She kept coming back because the money was good. Better than anything else she'd been able to find that didn't require a degree she didn't have. And because somewhere in the middle of her 3rd week at Blackthorne Estate, something happened that she hadn't expected. She met Evelyn. It was an accident, the way most things in Harper's life tended to be. She'd been tasked with delivering afternoon tea to the East Sitting Room, a task that should have taken 8 minutes and involved no complications whatsoever, except that she took a wrong turn. She was still learning the layout of the house, which was enormous and deliberately confusing, built in that old money way where the architecture itself seemed designed to make servants feel disoriented, and ended up pushing the cart down a corridor she didn't recognize, past a door that stood slightly open, She heard a voice inside. "Robert?" A woman's voice, old, soft, with a thread of real fear running through it. "Robert, I don't know where I am. I can't find the garden." Harper stopped the cart. The protocol, which Mrs. Aldridge had made very clear in her orientation, was explicit. Do not enter rooms unless directed. Do not engage with family members unless spoken to first. Do not insert yourself into situations that are not your assigned task. Harper pushed the door open. The woman sitting in the armchair by the window was clearly Evelyn Blackthorne. Harper had seen her photograph in the household briefing materials and on the silver-framed portraits lining the main staircase, but she looked nothing like those photographs now. In those images, Evelyn was imperious and controlled, her white hair sculpted, her posture commanding. Now she sat crumpled in the chair with her hands pressed together in her lap, her eyes moving around the room with an expression Harper recognized from her father's hospital ward. That lost look. That terrible, frightened look that meant someone's mind had slipped its leash and gone somewhere the person couldn't follow. "Mrs. Blackthorne?" Harper kept her voice even, calm. Not the fake calm that people used with elderly people like they were children, but the real kind. The kind she'd learned from the nurses at Mercy General, who could walk into a room full of fear and lower the temperature just by how they breathed. "I'm Harper. I work here. I got a little turned around, actually. I'm looking for the East sitting room." Evelyn looked at her. The fear in her eyes didn't disappear entirely, but it shifted. Something about having another person in the room, another voice, another presence, pulled her back an inch or two from whatever edge she'd been standing on. "The East sitting room," Evelyn repeated slowly. "Yes, ma'am. They sent me with the afternoon tea." Harper nodded at the cart. "Though honestly, I'm completely lost. I keep making wrong turns. It's a beautiful house, but the layout's not exactly intuitive, is it?" Evelyn blinked at her. Then, to Harper's considerable surprise, a thin smile crossed her face. "My husband designed it that way," she said, "on purpose. He said it kept people honest. If you're lost, you can't be sneaking." That's one way to look at it. He was a complicated man. Most people are. They looked at each other for a moment. Evelyn's hands had unclenched in her lap. The fear had receded further. "The East sitting room is down this corridor," Evelyn said, then left at the painting of the horses. "The one with the gray mare." "Thank you," Harper said. Then, because she wasn't always as careful as she should have been about protocol, she added, "Are you all right, ma'am? You seemed... I heard you call out." The shuttered look came down immediately. Evelyn straightened in the chair, and for a moment she looked exactly like the woman in the portraits. "I was speaking on the telephone." "Of course," Harper said. "Sorry to intrude." She backed out with the cart. She found the gray mare painting. She delivered the tea 7 minutes late, and Mrs. Aldridge docked her 20 minutes of pay, and Harper paid it without argument. She didn't tell anyone what she'd seen. It happened again 2 weeks later, and then a week after that, and slowly, across the autumn months, a pattern established itself that neither of them had agreed to, and neither of them ever explicitly named. Harper took wrong turns. She found Evelyn in rooms where the old woman had drifted to. The library, the conservatory's back alcove, once memorably the wine cellar, standing in the dark with a confused expression and a 1987 Bordeaux she clearly had no memory of picking up. Harper would arrive, calm and steady and matter-of-fact, and she would talk Evelyn back into herself, not by treating her like someone broken, but by giving her something external to anchor to. A task, a conversation, the weight of another person's ordinary presence. Evelyn never mentioned it in the light of day. But one evening, as Harper was straightening the books on the sitting room shelves, a task that was not assigned to her but which gave her a reason to be in the room, Evelyn said, without looking up from her needlework, "You don't pity me." Harper considered the book in her hands. "No. The others do. I can see it on their faces." A pause. "Pity is another word for contempt." "I know. You have someone," Evelyn said, not a question. "Someone you watched this happen to?" Harper put the book back. "My father." Evelyn set down the needlework. She looked at Harper directly, one of the few times she ever did in those early months, and there was something in her eyes that had nothing to do with the illness. There was the woman underneath the illness, the woman who had survived whatever it took to become Evelyn Blackthorne. "Then you understand," Evelyn said, That what I need most is not sympathy. It's discretion. Yes, ma'am. Can you be discreet, Harper? I already have been. Evelyn held her gaze for another moment. Then she picked up her needlework again. Good. You may go. Harper went. But something had shifted between them, quiet and permanent, the way tectonic things shift, not with drama, but with consequence. The rest of the staff noticed none of this, which was by design. What they noticed instead was every clumsy thing Harper did, cataloged and shared with the quiet viciousness of people who have found a mutual target. She bumped a serving tray on the library doorframe during the weekly staff meeting and sent crystal glasses sliding. Only one broke, but the sound of it brought 6 faces swiveling toward her with identical expressions of barely suppressed delight. She misjudged the distance to the dining table during a formal dinner setup and sent a floral centerpiece listing sideways. She dropped a silver polishing cloth behind the radiator in the main hallway and spent 20 minutes trying to fish it out while Priya and Caroline walked past twice, each time with that particular silence that was louder than laughter. She was by any measure a disaster of a maid. She knew it. The house knew it. The fact that she was still employed was something she didn't examine too closely, because examining it might reveal something fragile underneath. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that her continued employment had been quietly noted and quietly protected by Evelyn Blackthorne, who had said nothing explicit to anyone, but who had a way of looking at Mrs. Aldridge when the subject of staff efficiency came up that made the older woman find reasons to change the subject. The staff didn't know this either. It wouldn't have mattered to them if they had. Cruelty doesn't require logic. It only requires a target, and Harper was a very available target. She was overweight in a house full of angular, disciplined bodies. She was clumsy in a house that fetishized precision. She had no family connections or social capital or visible reason to be taken seriously. She was, in the parlance of this kind of institution, someone it was safe to dismiss. So they dismissed her, daily, in the small, relentless ways that leave no marks. Harper absorbed it. She had practice. She kept her head down. She sent her paychecks to Mercy General. She learned the layout of the house, eventually, and stopped getting lost, which reduced the frequency of her accidental visits to Evelyn, though she still found her way to the old woman's rooms with a regularity that had become, by winter, something close to routine. She told herself it was professional, a kind of specialized duty she'd assigned herself. She was not entirely honest with herself about what it had become. The first time she met Adrian Blackthorne, she was on her knees behind a sofa. She'd dropped a silver pen. Not hers, one she'd found on the hallway floor and was in the process of returning to the study, and it had rolled under the sitting room furniture with the kind of precision that only inanimate objects rolling in the wrong direction could achieve. She was stretched behind the sofa, cheek nearly pressed to the floor, one arm extended as far as it would go, fingers just brushing the pen's barrel when the door opened. She heard footsteps. They stopped. "The hell are you doing?" The voice was low, flat, and entirely unamused. Harper had heard that voice before, in the background of rooms, behind closed doors, on the phone in the study where she sometimes dusted, but she had never been in the same room with it while positioned in this particular manner. She retrieved the pen. She sat up. She stood with as much dignity as the situation allowed, which was not very much. Adrian Blackthorne was not what she expected, which was a thought she immediately recognized as ridiculous, because she didn't know what she'd expected. She'd seen photographs. She'd heard the staff talk about him in that specific lowered voice people use for things that frighten them while also fascinating them. But photographs and lowered voices hadn't prepared her for the sheer physical fact of him. 34 years old, built like someone who had spent considerable time doing things that required physical force, with dark hair and a face that had been handsome once, and still was, technically, but in the way that things were handsome after they'd been through something, a quality of carved-down severity. He wore an expensive suit with the jacket pushed back and his collar open, and he was looking at her with an expression that was not particularly hostile, but was also not particularly warm. It was the expression of a man who found most of the world mildly irritating. "I dropped a pen," Harper said. He looked at the pen in her hand. "Whose pen is that?" "I'm not sure. I found it in the hallway." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's my mother's pen. She's been looking for it for 3 days." "Oh." Harper looked at the pen. "I'll return it." I'll take it. He held out his hand. She gave him the pen. Their fingers didn't touch. He looked down at it briefly, then at her, with that flat assessment that she supposed was the way men like him looked at everything, estimating cost and risk and utility. You're the new one, he said. I've been here since September. 3 months, still new. He tucked the pen into his jacket pocket. Try not to break anything. He walked out. Harper stood in the middle of the sitting room for a moment, feeling the particular residue that contact with powerful people tended to leave. Not quite unpleasant, not quite neutral. More like the feeling of standing too close to something electrical. She straightened her uniform. She went back to work. She told herself, with considerable firmness, that there was nothing interesting about Adrian Blackthorne. She was, again, not entirely honest with herself. But December arrived with the specific brutality of upstate New York winters. The estate transformed, not in a pleasant way. The cold didn't soften the house's architecture. It hardened it, turning the stone exterior into something glacial, making the driveway approach look like something out of a photograph of places where bad things happened. The staff worked longer hours. The fireplaces ran constantly. Extra wood was ordered, stacked, split. And then the invitations went out. Harper didn't see the invitations themselves. She wasn't that level of staff. But she heard about them through the kitchen and the linen room and the particular telegraph of overheard conversations that constituted staff information infrastructure. The Blackthorne Annual Winter Gala. A charity event nominally. In practice, a gathering of the most influential people in the syndicate sphere, and this year, their closest rivals. The DeLuca organization. She heard this name for the first time from Priya, who was pulling tablecloths from the linen press with sharp, efficient movements, and speaking to Caroline in a tone that assumed Harper, folding napkins at the other end of the table, wasn't worth modifying. The DeLuca girl is coming, Priya said. Isabella. I know, Caroline said. Adrian's supposedly going to announce the engagement. Supposedly. Priya's voice was dry. He looks thrilled about it. Since when does he have to look thrilled? It's business. She's something else. I worked the DeLuca event last year before I came here. She's the kind of woman who sends food back 3 times because she can. Harper folded a napkin, then another. She must be something, though, Caroline said. Merging the Blackthorne and DeLuca operations, that's not a small thing. It's huge, Priya said. Vincent DeLuca's been waiting to get his hands into the Blackthorne distribution network for 15 years. This is his way in. And Adrian's way out of what? Priya shrugged. Whatever war would have started if they didn't. That's how these things work. You either merge or you fight, and fighting costs money. Harper folded another napkin. Her fingers were very steady. I hear she's beautiful, Caroline said. She's exactly what she looks like, Priya said. Everything on the surface, nothing underneath. Harper put down the napkin. She picked up another one. She was thinking about Evelyn, who would be at the gala. Who was always at the gala. See, it was her house, her tradition. She had presided over this event for 30 years and would not stop presiding over it now, not even when the edges of her mind were growing uncertain. She would stand in her blue silk gown, and she would shake hands, and she would be Evelyn Blackthorne, and at some point in the evening she might slip, and if she slipped at the wrong moment in front of the wrong people, the consequences would be unpredictable. Harper filed this thought away. She kept folding napkins. She kept it to herself. The night of the gala was cold enough to make the teeth ache. Harper had been on double shifts since 6 in the morning, and by the time the guests began arriving at 8, her feet were throbbing inside her shoes with a persistent, low-grade cruelty that she had learned to breathe through. She moved through the event on peripheral routes, circulating with trays, replenishing champagne, slipping through service doors that the guests walked past without registering, because guests at events like this were very good at not registering people carrying trays. The house was full of extraordinary-looking people in extraordinary clothes, and the whole effect was a kind of visual noise. Too much beauty, too much money, all of it lit from chandeliers in a way that made everyone look slightly unreal. Harper had grown up working class in a mid-sized city, and she had never been particularly susceptible to wealth as an aesthetic, but she was not entirely immune to the particular vertigo of being the plainest person in a very beautiful room. She had gained weight during the worst of her father's illness, the result of stress and convenience food, and the particular metabolic shutdown that happened when the body was under sustained duress. And she was aware of herself in her black uniform in a way she was usually too busy to be, aware of the way the fabric strained slightly at her shoulders, aware of the way she moved between these thin, luminous people like something terrestrial among birds. Not with self-pity, just with the factual awareness of difference. She circulated. She collected empty glasses. She kept her head down. She was watching for Evelyn. She spotted her at 9:15, standing near the string quartet, with a champagne glass she was not drinking from, and Harper watched her carefully from across the room, running the checklist she'd developed over months of close observation. Was the expression appropriate to the immediate social situation? Yes. Was she responding to the person speaking to her? Yes, though the responses had a slight lag that someone who didn't know her wouldn't notice. Were her hands steady? Mostly. Harper had learned to read Evelyn the way sailors read weather, not for drama, but for the signs that came before. The first real spike of concern came around 10. She'd lost sight of Evelyn in the crowd for 12 minutes. She'd been pulled into the kitchen to deal with a catering crisis, and when she came back out, the old woman was not where she'd been. Not at the quartet. Not with the cluster of matriarch-adjacent women near the fireplace. Not at the bar. Harper made a circuit of the main hall, then the dining room, then the smaller reception room off the east corridor. Not there. She widened her circuit, moving faster now, excusing herself through groups of people who didn't notice her going through. The library, empty, except for two men in close conversation who fell silent when she entered. The study, locked. The winter garden room, no. She turned down the corridor toward the conservatory and saw light under the door. She almost knocked. Protocol said knock. Protocol also said don't insert yourself into situations that aren't your assigned task, and she'd violated that one repeatedly and consistently for 3 months, so she pushed the door open instead. The conservatory was long and glassed in on two sides, full of winter plants that shouldn't have been alive in December, but were, because someone paid a great deal of money to make them so. At the far end, near the wrought iron table, stood two women. Evelyn was in her blue silk gown, and she was standing with her shoulders pulled up the way she did when she was frightened. That particular posture Harper had learned to recognize, the one that meant the woman inside had retreated and left the exterior on its own. Isabella DeLuca was standing 3 feet from her. Harper had seen her arrive earlier in the evening and had registered her the way she registered most things, as information. Late 20s, 5'10" in heels that added another 3 inches. Dark hair, a white gown that probably cost more than Harper made in 6 months, with a structured bodice and a skirt that moved like water when she walked. Beautiful, certainly. Priya had been right about that, in the way that certain weapons were beautiful. And there was something in the line of her face, even now, from across the room, that Harper associated with the particular cruelty of people who had never been told no at a volume they could hear. She was speaking to Evelyn. Harper couldn't hear the words from the doorway. She moved closer, along the wall, past hanging ferns and potted plants until she was close enough. "Not going to be here much longer," Isabella was saying. Her voice was pleasant, conversational. It was the pleasantness that was the cruelest thing about it. "You understand that, don't you? Once Adrian and I are married, this house runs differently. Decisions get made by people who are actually capable of making them." A pause. "I've heard about your condition. I've spoken to your doctors. Yes, don't look surprised. There are people who talk when asked the right way. You're going to need real care soon. More care than a drafty estate and a handful of maids can provide." Evelyn said something Harper couldn't hear. "What?" Isabella's pleasantness thinned by 1 degree. "I can't hear you when you mumble. That's exactly the problem." Evelyn's chin came up. Harper recognized that too. The spine stiffening that sometimes happened when the real woman surfaced through the confusion. The inherited steel of someone who had lived inside power long enough to know how it moved. "I am still the Blackthorn matriarch," Evelyn said, and her voice was clear. Isabella looked at her for a moment. Then she smiled, and the smile was very beautiful and very empty. "For now," she said. The room shifted. Isabella reached out with something that might have been deliberate and might have been a negligent gesture. Harper never determined which. And her hand caught Evelyn's champagne glass, tilting it, and the red wine that Evelyn had somehow ended up holding went across the white gown in a wide, dark stain. Silence. Isabella looked down at her gown. Then she looked up at Evelyn, and the pleasantness was entirely gone. And what replaced it was something Harper recognized in the way she recognized the smell of smoke, by animal instinct, before rational thought had a chance to engage. "You stupid—" Her arm came up. Harper was already moving. She had crossed the length of the conservatory in something that was not quite running. She had the tray in one hand and a terrible clarity in her chest, the kind that arrives when a decision has already been made by some deeper apparatus than conscious thought. She stepped between Isabella's raised arm and Evelyn's face, and she had a half-second to process that this was happening and she was doing this, and then Isabella's hand came down and the diamond ring on her right hand, large, encrusted, the kind of ring that was also a weapon without its owner necessarily intending it to be, caught Harper across the cheekbone. The pain was a white explosion. She heard the tray hit the floor. She heard Evelyn make a sound. She felt her knees hit the marble. Hot liquid was running down her face. Her hand went up and came away red, and she had time to think distantly that this was probably bad. And then the conservatory door opened behind her and she heard footsteps, and then a voice, flat, low, and electrified by something she'd never heard in it before. "What the—" She turned her head, pressing her hand to her face, and Adrian Blackthorne was standing in the doorway of the conservatory. His eyes moved across the room. Evelyn pressed against the wall with her hands at her mouth, Isabella standing with her arms still half raised, Harper on the floor with blood running through her fingers. And something happened in his face, something that was not the flat assessment she'd seen before. Something that cracked the surface of the man who never let the surface crack. He looked at Harper on the floor. He looked at his mother. He looked at Isabella. And the temperature in the room dropped 20 degrees. Harper pressed her hand harder against her cheek and tried to stand up because her knees on the marble were starting to hurt, and she had the instinct, deep and automatic, that whatever was about to happen next was going to be significant, and she needed to be upright for it. But her legs weren't cooperating entirely, and the pain in her face was spreading, and the blood was warm and constant against her palm. And then Adrian Blackthorne crossed the room in 4 strides and crouched down in front of her and put his hand over hers and said very quietly, "Don't." She stopped trying to stand. His hand was warm. His eyes, up close, were darker than she'd thought, and they were looking at her with an expression she had no immediate category for. Not pity, not the flat assessment, something that was neither of those things and was, somehow, worse to receive than either. Behind him, Evelyn was speaking, and Isabella was speaking, and somewhere in the house music was playing, and somewhere beyond that the entire machinery of the gala was still running, and Harper's cheek was still bleeding, and none of it, for the length of that moment, seemed quite real. "Hold still," Adrian said. She held still. The hand over hers pressed gently. The blood kept coming, hot and steady. And somewhere beneath the pain and the noise and the spinning unreality of it, Harper Quinn understood, with the peculiar clarity that sometimes arrived alongside shock, that she had just done something from which there was no retreating. Not because it had been seen, not because it would have consequences, but because it had been real. More real than anything that had happened to her in 3 years of diminishment and exhaustion and keeping her head down. And there was no undoing real things once they happened. She had stepped in front of it. She had taken it. And the man crouching in front of her with his hand over her bleeding face was looking at her like he was trying to figure out exactly what she was, and his mother was still shaking against the wall, and Isabella De Luca was standing very still in her ruined white gown, and somewhere in the blood and pain and cold marble and the distant sound of strings playing something slow, Harper Quinn became, without choosing it, without understanding what it meant yet, the center of something. What she didn't know, and couldn't have known, was what was still in her bloodstream, what had entered through the cut on her face, what had been waiting on Isabella De Luca's ring before it ever touched her skin. She didn't know any of that yet. She just held still, because Adrian had told her to, and she had the strange feeling, frightened and alive and more awake than she'd been in years, that still was the most important thing she'd ever been. Adrian did not stand up immediately. He stayed crouched on the conservatory floor with his hand pressed over Harper's, and the blood kept seeping through their fingers, dark against his pale skin, and he did not look at Isabella. He did not look at his mother. He looked at Harper's face, at the cut, which was deep and jagged and still producing blood at a rate that told him it needed more than a bandage. And something moved behind his eyes that he did not let reach the rest of his face. Then he stood. He took his hand away from hers. He reached into his jacket pocket and produced a folded white handkerchief and held it down to her without speaking. She took it. She pressed it to her cheek. He watched her do it for 1 second, and then he turned around. Isabella was standing 3 feet away, the red wine stain spreading across the front of her white gown like something geological, her chin up and her jaw set in the particular way of a person preparing a defense before they've been charged with anything. She was still beautiful. She was absolutely beautiful, and it meant nothing at all, and Adrian looked at her the way he looked at things he was about to remove from the room. "Explain," he said, not loudly. That was the thing about Adrian Blackthorne that the staff talked about in their lowered voices. He was never loud when he was dangerous. Loud was for people who needed volume to be frightening. He did not. "It was an accident," Isabella said. Her voice was level, smooth. She had the social intelligence to understand the severity of the moment, but not quite enough to understand that social intelligence was no longer the relevant currency. "The glass slipped. Don't." Isabella stopped. "I was in the hallway," he said, "for 45 seconds before I came in. I heard enough." The conservatory was very quiet. The distant music from the main hall reached them as a kind of irrelevant murmur. Evelyn had pressed herself into the corner near the planting bench, both hands gripping the iron edge, and her eyes were fixed on Adrian with an expression that was equal parts relief and a deep, exhausted grief. The expression of someone who has been proven right about something and wishes entirely that they had been wrong. "She spilled wine on my gown," Isabella said, each word placed with careful precision. "I was frustrated, that's all." "Your ring opened her face." "I didn't—" She stopped, recalibrated. "I didn't intend—" "I don't care what you intended." The temperature in the room had not changed. Everything else had. Isabella's eyes moved to Harper on the floor, then back to Adrian, and something shifted in her expression. Not remorse, Harper noted. Not quite. More the recalculation of someone reassessing which version of events was most survivable. "She's a maid," Isabella said. "Adrian, don't finish that sentence." She finished it anyway. She was, Harper would understand later, a woman who had never once been made to stop in the middle of a sentence, and so had no real experience of knowing when she should. "She's a maid who inserted herself into a private conversation. Whatever happened to her face is the result of her own poor—" Adrian moved, not toward Isabella. He turned to the door, opened it, and said 2 words to whoever was standing in the corridor beyond. "Get Moss." Moss was the estate's head of security. Harper knew him vaguely. A large, quiet man with gray in his beard who moved through the house with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once needed to rush, because things arranged themselves according to his preferences. He appeared in the conservatory door within 90 seconds, which told Harper he'd already been close. "Get her a car," Adrian said, not looking at Isabella, looking at Moss. "Front gate, now." Isabella went very still. "Adrian?" Her voice had changed. The smoothness had developed a hairline fracture. "The announcement is not happening. Our fathers agreed—" "Tell your father to call me." He turned back to face her fully, and Harper, on the floor with the handkerchief pressed to her face, had a clear view of his profile. And what she saw there was not anger, exactly. It was something colder and more deliberate than anger, something that had already moved past the emotional stage into something operational. "Tonight is over. The engagement is over. Get out of my house." Isabella stood for a moment that stretched and stretched. Then she walked past him. At the door, she stopped. She did not turn around. "You'll regret this," she said. "My father will not—" "I know what your father will do," Adrian said. "I've been prepared for it for 2 years. He's the one who hasn't been prepared. Go." She went. The sound of her heels on marble diminished down the corridor. Adrian turned to Moss. "Get a doctor in here, not the gala physician. Calloway. Tell him it's facial." Moss nodded and disappeared. Adrian crossed to his mother. Evelyn had not moved from the planting bench. She was holding the iron edge with both hands and looking at him with that complicated expression, and when he reached her, she let go of the bench and he caught her hands and held them and said something too quiet for Harper to hear. Evelyn's face changed. The fear drained out of it slowly, replaced by something that was not quite peace, but was the relief of a long-held position finally released. She spoke. He listened. He nodded once, then once again. Then he let go of her hands and turned to look at Harper. She was still on the floor. She hadn't stood up because she'd been watching them instead of attending to the practical matter of her own situation, which was characteristic, and also because her legs still felt uncertain and the handkerchief against her face was showing red through the white. "Can you stand?" he asked. "Yes," she said, and stood, which involved one moment of the floor tilting sideways and her hand catching the edge of the wrought iron table for balance, but she managed it. He watched her do it. "What's your name?" She almost said, "You already know my name." 3 months in the house. He'd spoken to her once, in the sitting room with the pen. But she looked at his face, the careful blankness of it, the focused attention underneath, and understood he was asking for something other than the information. "Harper," she said. "Harper Quinn." He looked at her for another second. "Sit down, Harper Quinn. The doctor is coming." She sat down. Dr. Calloway arrived 11 minutes later. He was a lean, silver-haired man with the kind of hands that moved without wasted motion, and he looked at the cut on Harper's face with a penlight and a clinical expression and said, "This needs stitching. 6, maybe 7. "Here?" Harper asked. "I'd prefer my office. There's a car." "Here," Adrian said from the doorway. Calloway looked at him. Something passed between them that Harper couldn't fully read. Then the doctor opened his bag and said, "I'll need you very still." "I can do still," Harper said. He numbed the area first, which was its own brief specific pain, and then she was very still, and he stitched her, and she watched the conservatory ceiling and listened to the sounds of the gala beyond the walls, the music, the voices, the clink and murmur of people who didn't know yet that anything had shifted. And she breathed through it. Adrian was still in the doorway. She could see him in her peripheral vision, though she kept her eyes on the ceiling. He had his arms crossed, and he was watching Calloway work with that same operational focus. And at one point he said, "Deep?" "Deeper than it looks," Calloway said without looking up. "The angle was..." He paused, continued. "The angle was unusual. I want to run a precautionary blood panel, given the mechanism of injury." "What mechanism?" Harper asked, because she was still present and no one had told her to be otherwise. "The ring," Calloway said. "The metal. Some people have reactions. I don't have metal allergies." He was still working. His voice had taken on a quality that Harper, who had spent the better part of a year in medical settings, recognized as the quality of a person who was saying something other than what they were thinking. She looked at Adrian. He was looking at Calloway. "Run the panel," Adrian said. "I'll need a blood draw." "Then draw it." Calloway drew it. He put the vial in his bag with careful hands. He finished the stitching, applied a dressing, gave Harper a card with aftercare instructions that he recited while watching her face with an attention that was slightly more than the situation warranted. Then he closed his bag. "I'll have results in 3 hours," he said to Adrian. 4 at the outside. Call me." Calloway left. Harper sat in the chair with the dressing on her face and listened to the blood rushing in her ears and thought about the way Calloway had paused over the word mechanism, the way he'd said unusual, the way he had not quite looked at her when he said some people have reactions. Adrian was looking at her. "What is it?" she said. "Nothing." That wasn't nothing. The doctor is being thorough. He looked at the ring. Adrian said nothing. He asked about the mechanism of injury before he even looked at the cut, Harper said. Her voice was steady. She had a talent for steady when things were going wrong. It was the same mechanism that had gotten her through emergency rooms and hospital waiting areas, and the specific 3 a.m. quality of bad news arriving by phone. That's not a standard question for a facial laceration. Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Go home, Harper. I'll have someone drive you. I'm still on shift. Your shift is done." "Mrs. Aldridge. I'll deal with Mrs. Aldridge." He pushed off the doorframe. "Go home. Get some sleep. I'll be in touch tomorrow." He walked out. Harper sat alone in the conservatory with the winter plants and the cold glass walls and the distant sound of music from a party that was still technically happening, and she pressed her fingertips carefully against the edge of the dressing on her face and thought about the way Calloway had put the blood vial in his bag. Like it was important, like it was urgent, like whatever he was looking for, he expected to find it. She didn't sleep. The driver took her home in a car that cost more than her monthly rent, and she sat in the back seat with her face reflected in the dark window, the white square of the dressing, the bruising already beginning to bloom around it. And she went through the evening methodically, the way she did when she couldn't make sense of something. Start at the beginning. Work forward. Don't skip. She'd found Evelyn in the conservatory. Isabella had been there. The ring had come down. Adrian had arrived. And then Calloway had come, and he had stitched her face and drawn her blood and said the word mechanism in a way that landed wrong, and Adrian had told her to go home with an urgency underneath his flatness that she hadn't recognized at the time but recognized now, in the back of the car, in the dark. He'd wanted her away from the house, not because he was done with her, because he needed her somewhere safe before he dealt with whatever was coming next. She sat with that thought for a long time. The driver didn't speak. The city moved past the windows, then gave way to the street she lived on, a street of narrow houses and patchy sidewalks. Nothing like the estate, aggressively ordinary in a way that usually felt like a relief and tonight felt like a verdict. She went inside. She sat in her kitchen. She did not sleep. At 3:17 in the morning, her phone rang. She looked at the screen. The number was one she didn't recognize. She answered it anyway. "Ms. Quinn," Calloway's voice, precise, careful, and stripped of everything medical. "I need you to listen to me. Are you at home?" "Yes." "Are you feeling any symptoms? Numbness, tingling, chest?" "I feel fine." A pause. "Should I not?" A silence that lasted 3 seconds too long. "The blood panel," Calloway said, "found traces of a synthetic compound. The name wouldn't mean anything to you. It's a neurotoxin, engineered, not naturally occurring." Another pause. "It's typically delivered by contact, skin absorption." Harper heard the words. She arranged them in order. She did it twice. "The ring," she said. "Yes. It was on the ring. In the setting. The mechanism was designed to... When the ring makes contact with skin, it..." He stopped. "Yes. The ring." Harper put her hand flat on the kitchen table. The surface was cool under her palm. "How much did I absorb?" "The laceration, actually, it's counterintuitive, but the bleeding likely flushed a significant portion of the compound before it could fully absorb. The levels we found are concerning, but not immediately." He stopped again. "You're not in immediate danger. We've identified the compound. There's a course of treatment that will neutralize it completely. I've already arranged..." "Who was it meant for?" Silence. "Dr. Calloway." Her voice was very flat and very controlled. "The ring was on Isabella DeLuca's hand. She was going to hit Evelyn. The ring was meant to make contact with Evelyn's skin." She waited. "Who was the target?" He didn't answer, which was its own answer. "Adrian," she said, "I can't..." She would have shaken his hand at some point in the evening, or touched his face, or... She stopped. The engagement was going to be announced tonight. She would have been close to him. She would have touched him. Harper breathed through her nose. The kitchen was very quiet. It wasn't an alliance, it was an assassination. Another silence. "I've briefed Mr. Blackthorne," Calloway said. He's been informed. There's a car coming to your address in 20 minutes. For treatment. I'll be there personally." "Does he know I..." "Yes." "How did he..." "Ms. Quinn." Calloway's voice shifted into something that was not quite gentle, because he wasn't quite a gentleman, but was the closest approximation he had. "He's the one who sent me the panel results before I'd even called him. He was waiting for them." She sat with that. 20 minutes, she said. "Yes." She hung up. She sat at the kitchen table in the silence of her ordinary house on her ordinary street, and she held the information inside her like something physical, something that had weight and temperature and took up space. Isabella DeLuca had come to the Blackthorne Gala with poison in her jewelry. The engagement had been a delivery mechanism. The alliance had been a murder dressed in silk. And Harper, who had spent 3 years being invisible, who had spent the evening carrying trays and watching for a frightened old woman and being nobody that mattered, Harper had stepped between the ring and its intended target, and in doing so had not stopped a slap. She had stopped an assassination. She had no idea, yet, what that meant for what came next. But she heard the sound of a car turning onto her street, and she stood up from the table, and she thought of Adrian Blackthorne crouched on the conservatory floor with his hand over hers, pressing the blood back, saying don't, and holding. The car that came for her was black and unmarked and driven by a man who did not introduce himself, and Harper sat in the back seat with her hands in her lap and watched the city go past, and did not ask where they were going because she already understood that the geography of her life had changed, and the old landmarks no longer applied. They did not take her back to the estate. They took her to a building in a part of the city she didn't know well, a medical facility, private, the kind that did not have a sign out front and did not appear in any directory she'd ever consulted. Calloway was waiting at the entrance with two people Harper didn't recognize, both in dark clothing, both carrying the particular stillness of people who were paid to be ready for things. Inside, Calloway said, not unkindly, just with urgency wearing the mask of ordinary instruction. She went inside. The treatment took 40 minutes. An IV line, a drip that Calloway watched with the focus of a man diffusing something, periodic checks of her blood pressure and pulse, with equipment that looked too specialized for a routine clinic. She sat in the chair and let him work, and asked the question she needed answered. How long has the compound been in my system? Approximately 4 hours. And if you hadn't identified it? Calloway was quiet for a moment. 12 hours. Maybe 15. The early symptoms would have presented as viral. By the time a standard emergency room identified the compound, he stopped. They wouldn't have. It's not in any standard toxicology panel. It requires specific testing. The only reason I knew to look for it is because I recognized the ring. Harper looked at him. You recognized the ring. He kept his eyes on the IV line. The setting, the configuration of the stones. I've seen that specific modification before. A pause. Once. On someone else. On a case I consulted on. 4 years ago. He adjusted the drip rate by a fraction. The victim was a mid-level trafficking coordinator. He shook hands with the wrong person at a fundraiser in Miami and was dead within 18 hours. The toxicology panel came back clean because no one knew what to test for. He paused again. I made it my business to know. After that, Harper absorbed this. Outside the room, she could hear movement, quiet, purposeful, the sound of people doing coordinated things. The DeLucas have used this before, she said. Someone has. Whether that traces directly to the DeLucas or to someone they contracted, he shrugged, a small, precise movement. That's above my expertise. Is it above Adrian's? Calloway removed the IV line with careful hands and pressed a cotton square to the crook of her elbow. He looked at her then, directly, for the first time since she'd arrived. Mr. Blackthorne would like to speak with you, he said. When you're ready. I'm ready now? You've had a significant I'm ready now. He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded and stood and went to the door and said something to whoever was outside. 3 minutes later, Adrian walked in.
He is
He had changed out of the gala suit. He was in dark trousers and a plain shirt with the sleeves pushed to the elbows, and he looked like he hadn't sat down since the conservatory, which she suspected was accurate. He looked at the dressing on her face first, then at her face beneath it. Then he pulled a chair to face her and sat down and put his forearms on his knees and looked at her with that focused attention that she was beginning to understand was not flatness, but concentration. The look of a man who was processing multiple simultaneous threats and had briefly prioritized this room. How do you feel? He asked. Fine. Calloway's thorough. He is. A pause. Are you going to tell me I owe you an apology? She looked at him. For what? For not telling you what I suspected. When Calloway mentioned the mechanism, his jaw was tight. I should have. You didn't know for certain. I suspected. There's a difference between suspecting and knowing, Harper said. And if you told me your suspicion in the conservatory, I'd have panicked, and panicking in front of a room full of people wouldn't have helped either of us. He was quiet. What do you need from me? She asked. The question seemed to land differently than he expected. He looked at her for a moment with something that was almost, not quite, but almost surprise. I need to know exactly what you heard, he said, in the conservatory, before I arrived. Everything Isabella said. Exact words if you can. She told him. She was precise. She had a good memory for conversation, a skill developed from years of medical appointments where the exact phrasing of a doctor's statement could mean the difference between hope and its absence. And she gave it to him chronologically, without interpretation, the way she'd learned to relay information in contexts where accuracy mattered more than narrative. He listened without interrupting. At one point, he closed his eyes briefly, and something moved through his face. Not emotion exactly, but the registration of something clicking into a configuration he'd been building for a long time. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. She mentioned his doctors, Harper said. Isabella said she'd spoken to your mother's doctors, that there are people who talk when asked the right way. I heard that part. That means there's someone inside your mother's medical team who's been feeding information to the DeLucas. Yes. For how long? That's what I'm currently finding out. Harper pressed her fingertips to the edge of the dressing. The numbness from the local anesthetic was wearing off, and the ache beneath was beginning to make itself known. Not sharp yet, just a steady pressure that would worsen before it eased. The engagement was never real, she said. It was a delivery mechanism. The engagement was real, Adrian said, to my father's people, to the old guard on both sides who wanted the alliance. It was real to Vincent DeLuca because it gave him access to our distribution infrastructure. He leaned back slightly. It wasn't real to Isabella, or to whoever designed the ring. Would Vincent have known? The silence that followed was 3 seconds long and said everything. You don't know, Harper said. I know Vincent DeLuca has wanted control of this operation since before my father died, Adrian said. Whether he sanctioned a direct assassination or whether his daughter improvised. He stopped. His hands, resting on his knees, were very still. It changes the approach, not the conclusion. Harper looked at him. What's the conclusion? He met her eyes. That tonight ends it. What? She should have gone home. Calloway told her she should go home, that the treatment required rest and hydration and the absence of stress, which made Harper produce a sound that was not quite a laugh, but was adjacent to one, because the absence of stress was not a resource currently available to her. She stayed, not in the treatment room. They moved her to a smaller room off the main corridor, a waiting area essentially, with a sofa and a coffee machine that produced coffee of surprising quality. And she sat there and listened to the building work around her. Footsteps, voices behind closed doors, phones, the particular texture of an organization in rapid motion. She was on her second cup of coffee when the door opened and a woman came in. Harper didn't recognize her immediately. Then she did, and the recognition was disorienting enough that she set the cup down. Priya, not in her maid's uniform, in dark jeans and a jacket, with her hair loose, and with an expression that was completely unlike anything Harper had seen on her face in 3 months of shared shifts. Not the careful blankness of staff, not the small cruelty. Something harder and more specific, the expression of a person in their actual context rather than their performed one. You're awake, Priya said. You work for him, Harper said, not a question. The configuration assembled itself with immediate clarity. The months of proximity, the access, the ears in the staff kitchen, the way certain information had always seemed to move through the household in ways that felt less like gossip and more like intelligence. Priya sat down across from her. 3 years. Does Aldridge know? No. Caroline? No. Harper picked up the coffee cup again. Her hands were steady. She was aware of them being steady in the deliberate way, the awareness of the control rather than the control itself being natural, which meant she was closer to the edge than she was letting herself show. What do you actually do? Harper asked. I watch, Priya said simply. I listen. I pass along what's relevant. She paused. Tonight was relevant. You were there. In the conservatory? I was in the corridor. I saw her go in. I followed. A pause. I was 30 seconds behind you. Harper thought about that, 30 seconds. If she hadn't been moving, if she'd hesitated, if she'd knocked and waited, if she'd given protocol its due weight, 30 seconds would have meant Evelyn's face instead of hers, or the ring making no contact at all, Isabella stepping back, the moment passing, the poison undelivered and the evening continuing and the target surviving the night to be approached again another way. "You didn't go in," Harper said. "No." "Why?" Priya looked at her directly. "Because you were already there." The implication settled. Harper understood it the way you understood things that were uncomfortable, but by not looking away. "I wasn't protecting Adrian," Harper said. "I was protecting Evelyn. I didn't know about the ring." "I know that." "So if I hadn't been there, then I would have gone in." Priya's voice was even. "And it would have been my face." Harper put the coffee down again. The room was very quiet. "The mole in Evelyn's medical team," Harper said. "Do you know who it is?" Priya's expression shifted by 1 degree. Something tightened around her eyes that told Harper the answer before she spoke it. "We have a name," Priya said. "We've had it for 6 hours. And? And it's complicated." "How complicated?" Priya looked at the door, then back. "It's Calloway." The silence that followed was total. Harper heard her own breathing. She heard the coffee machine across the room cycling through some automated process. She heard, from somewhere deeper in the building, the low, indistinct murmur of Adrian's voice behind a door. "Calloway?" she said. "He's the one who flagged the toxin," Priya said. "We know that. We're not saying he—" She stopped, started again. "It's more complicated than a clean betrayal. The information he's been passing, it's been selective, specific. It doesn't look like someone working for the DeLucas outright. It looks like someone being leveraged. Blackmailed." "We think so." Harper looked at the door that led back toward the main corridor, toward the treatment room, toward the chair where Calloway had sat with his careful hands and his specific knowledge of a toxin he claimed to have studied in the aftermath of a murder in Miami. "He treated me," she said. "Yes. He identified the compound and treated me and called Adrian with the results." Harper kept her voice level. "If he were working against Adrian, he could have said the panel was clean," Priya said. "He could have sent you home with nothing. Let the compound do what it was designed to do." A pause. "He didn't. So he's not fully compromised." "We don't think so. We think he's someone who's been feeding low-level intelligence for months because someone has something on him and he didn't see a way out. And tonight, when it mattered..." She stopped. "He made a choice." Harper sat with that. The thing about working in hospitals, about spending a year and a half in the company of people facing the edges of their own capacity, it gave you a very specific sensitivity to the texture of moral compromise. The way people lived inside their bad choices, the way they justified and calibrated and sectioned off. Calloway had sat in that chair and treated her with absolute precision, and he had been frightened, and she had read the fear as the fear of a doctor managing a serious case. But it hadn't only been that. It had also been the fear of a man who was doing the right thing, and didn't know yet if he was going to survive it. "Where is he now?" Harper asked. "With Adrian." "Is he safe?" Priya looked at her with an expression that was somewhere between professional assessment and something more personal. "That depends on how the conversation goes." Harper stood up. Her legs were steadier than she expected. "Which room?" she said. "Harper?" "Which room?" Priya looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, "Third door on the left." Harper went. She didn't go in immediately. She stood outside the door and listened, because walking into rooms without listening first was a habit she'd been trying to correct, and also because the voices inside were audible through the gap at the bottom, and she needed to understand what she was walking into. Adrian's voice, flat. "How long?" Calloway. 14 months. "What did they have?" A pause that was long enough to be its own kind of answer. Then, "My daughter. She's 23. She was in a vehicle accident and it doesn't matter where. What matters is that certain people arranged for the charges to disappear in exchange for access. Periodic information, nothing operational. I was very clear that I would not..." "You were very clear." Adrian's voice was not loud. 14 months of clarity. "I never gave them anything that put your operation at risk. I managed what I gave them. I was careful. And tonight? Were you careful tonight?" Another silence. "I didn't know about the ring," Calloway said. "I want to be clear about that. I knew the DeLuca meeting was significant. I didn't know if I'd known they were planning a direct... His voice cracked slightly, a hairline fracture that the careful professional tone couldn't fully contain. I treated her. The woman. The maid. I identified the compound and I treated her and I called you. Whatever else I've done, I want that on record. It's on record, Adrian said. That's the only reason we're having this conversation instead of a different one. Harper pushed the door open. Both men looked at her. Calloway went pale in a specific way. Not the pallor of shock, but the pallor of a person seeing the consequence of their actions standing upright and looking at them. Adrian looked at her with that same focused attention and something else underneath. A tightness that might have been anger and might have been something he didn't have a ready category for. You should be resting, he said. Priya told me, Harper said to Calloway, about the leverage, about your daughter. Calloway looked at the floor. His hands, which were usually so precise, were pressed flat against his thighs. I'm not accusing you of anything, Harper said. I'm here because you need to understand something. She waited until he looked up. Whatever you gave them, however long you gave it, tonight you saved my life. You knew what to look for, and you looked for it, and you treated it, and you called him. That matters. That's not nothing. Calloway's throat worked. But it also means, Harper continued, that they know you identified the compound. They know the assassination failed, and they know you're the only person who could have caught it. She looked at Adrian. His daughter isn't safe. If the DeLucas figure out he burned their operation, I know, Adrian said. She needs to be. I know, Harper. The use of her first name, unadorned, landed with a weight she hadn't expected. She stopped. He was looking at her with that expression again, the one she didn't have a category for, the one that was neither the flat assessment nor the professional attention, but something underneath both of those, something that only appeared in the moments when the careful surface gave way to the actual man. I've already sent people, he said. She's being moved now. Harper breathed. Sit down, he said. Both of you. She sat. Calloway sat. Adrian stood between them and looked at the wall for a moment, and the calculation happening behind his eyes was visible only as a kind of density in the room, the weight of a decision assembling itself from its components. Then he turned around. Here's what happens now, he said. Calloway, you're done practicing medicine in this city, not as punishment, as protection. You'll be relocated, both of you. He looked at Calloway directly. You chose tonight. I'm choosing to acknowledge that. But you understand that trust, once... I understand, Calloway said, quietly, fully. Good. Adrian moved toward the door, then stopped. He turned and looked at Harper with an expression that was entirely unguarded for exactly 2 seconds before he controlled it again. And in those 2 seconds, she saw something that she felt in her sternum, a recognition she did not know what to do with. The compound, he said. Even with treatment, Calloway can give you the specifics. There may be residual effects. Over the next several days, you may experience, I'll be fine. You don't know that yet. Neither do you. She looked at him steadily. But I've been fine through worse. He looked at her. Something shifted in his face. She watched it happen. The controlled surface, the careful management of expression, the man who ran a criminal empire on the principle that showing too much was the same as showing weakness. And she watched it slip, briefly, irreversibly. The way things slipped when a person had been awake for 18 hours dealing with a betrayal and a near assassination, and the woman who had taken the impact of both was sitting in front of him saying, I've been fine through worse, with a dressing on her face and her hands flat on her knees. I know, he said. He walked out. Harper sat in the chair and listened to his footsteps recede down the corridor, and she thought about the ring and the poison and Calloway's careful hands and the 14 months of compromise and the 30 seconds that had separated what happened from what almost happened. She thought about the DeLucas, who were still operational, whose patriarch did not yet know his plan had failed, whose daughter was somewhere in this city. The call came at 5:47 in the morning. Harper was still in the waiting room, head tipped back against the sofa, not sleeping, but in that gray suspended state between exhaustion and function when she heard the shift in the building's energy. Footsteps faster, voices clipped, doors opening in sequence down the corridor. She was upright before she was fully conscious of deciding to be. Priya appeared in the doorway. Her face was tight. What happened? Harper said. Vincent DeLuca is making a move. Priya was already turning. He found out about Isabella. About the ring? About her being removed from the estate. About the engagement being ended. A pause. He doesn't know yet about the compound, but he knows his daughter got put in a car and sent away from the Blackthorn property, and he's interpreting that as a declaration. Is he wrong? Priya looked at her. No. Harper stood up. Her body informed her of several complaints simultaneously. The ache in her cheek had deepened overnight into something with real authority, and her legs had the weighted unsteadiness of a person who had not slept, and her mouth tasted like cold coffee and adrenaline. She noted all of it and set it aside and followed Priya into the corridor. The building had transformed. The quiet coordination of the night had given way to something faster and more urgent. Men in dark clothes moving with purpose, equipment being loaded, phones pressed to ears. Harper clocked it the way she'd learned to clock hospital corridors on bad nights. Who was running, who was walking, which direction the trouble was moving. She found Adrian in the main room, standing over a table that held a laptop, 2 phones, and a printed map with handwritten annotations. Moss stood on his right. 2 other men she didn't know stood to the left. They were all looking at something on the laptop screen, and the quality of their attention, the held breath of it, the specific density, told her whatever was on the screen was bad. She stopped in the doorway. Adrian looked up. Something crossed his face. Not surprise, exactly. More the registration of a complication he'd been expecting. You should be in the other room, he said. What's happening? Harper. What's on the screen? Moss looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at Harper for a long moment with that expression she'd learned to read as the calculation of costs and benefits happening in real time, and then he stepped aside. She crossed to the table and looked at the screen. It was a security feed. 3 panels. The first showed the exterior of a building she didn't recognize. Industrial, warehouse adjacent, somewhere with no visible signage. The second showed what she took a moment to identify, and then identified with a cold drop in her chest, the exterior of Blackthorn Estate's East Gate. The third showed a parking structure, multiple dark vehicles, the movement of people between them. He's mobilizing, she said. Vincent moved his people into position 40 minutes ago. Adrian's voice was flat and operational. He has the estate under surveillance. He's not moving on it yet because he doesn't know our current strength. A pause. He will make that assessment soon. And Evelyn's at the estate. Yes. Harper looked at the estate feed, the east gate, the stone walls, the house behind them, dark at this hour, enormous and still. You need to move her, Harper said. We're working on that. She won't go. Harper looked at him. She won't leave. She'll fight you. You know that. I know that, Adrian said, and something in his voice made her understand that this was the specific problem he'd been turning over. Not the tactical situation, which he understood and had resources to address, but this, his mother, who would plant her feet and become immovable at the suggestion of leaving her home. I can get her out, Harper said. The room went quiet. Not entirely quiet. The phone still murmured. The building still moved. But the specific quality of the attention in that room shifted and landed on her, and she felt it the way you felt weather, as a pressure against the skin. You're not, Adrian started. She'll go for me, Harper said. She won't go for your people. She won't go for Moss. She might go for you, but you can't be there because you need to be wherever you're going to be when Vincent makes his move. She looked at him steadily. She trusts me. I know how to talk to her when she's frightened. I know what she needs. A pause. Let me get her. Adrian's jaw was tight. There are DeLuca people on that gate. Watching the gate, not the service entrance on the north side. He looked at her. I've been using it for 3 months, she said. It doesn't show on the main security rotation because it was built before the current system. Evelyn told me about it. She paused. She told me a lot of things she didn't tell other people. Something moved through Adrian's face that was not professional, not operational, not the calculated assessment of the crime boss determining tactical resource allocation. It was something beneath all of that, something that looked, for the brief moment before he controlled it, like the expression of a man who is being shown the full shape of something he'd only understood partially before. He looked at Moss. Moss said, North service entrance is clean as of 20 minutes ago. Adrian looked back at Harper. You go in, you get her, you bring her to the secondary address. Moss will give you the location. He moved around the table until he was closer to her than he'd been since the conservatory floor, and his voice dropped half a register. You do not engage with anyone. You see DeLuca's people, you stop, you wait. You call Moss directly. He looked at her face, the dressing, the bruising underneath. Do you understand me? I understand you. Harper. I understand you, Adrian. The use of his name, not Mr. Blackthorne, not Sir, just his name, flat and direct, the way she'd heard Priya use it earlier, registered in his face as a small, precise impact. He held her gaze for 2 seconds. Then he stepped back. Moss, he said, give her a phone. The car dropped her 2 blocks from the estate's north boundary. The cold was absolute. 5:50 in the morning in December in upstate New York, and the sky was the color of a bruise healing, and her breath came in visible bursts that she watched disappear in front of her as she moved along the service road. Her cheek was throbbing with the specific authority of stitched tissue and cold air, and her eyes were dry from sleeplessness, and she was aware with each step of the unreality of what she was doing, walking toward a house under surveillance by a criminal organization to extract a woman with dementia before a war started. She kept her head down and her feet moving. The north service entrance was exactly where she remembered it. A narrow door set into the stone wall, old iron handle, hinges that had been oiled recently enough not to make noise. She had the key on her staff ring, which she'd been carrying in her coat pocket since the night before. The key still worked. The door swung open. She went in. The estate grounds at this hour were dark and cold and enormous, and she crossed them by the route she knew. The path between the kitchen garden and the old carriage house, then along the wall of the east wing, then through the service door that opened to the back stairwell. 3 minutes. She was inside. The house was quiet. She went up the back stairs to the second floor, moving quickly and without sound, and she was halfway down the east corridor toward Evelyn's rooms when she heard voices. She stopped. The voices were coming from the main stairwell landing, the ornate one, the family stairwell, not the service stairs. One voice she recognized as Richards, the overnight house manager, a man in his 60s who had worked for the Blackthorns for most of his adult life. The other voice she did not recognize, and the non-recognition itself was the alarm. She pressed herself against the corridor wall. Arrived 20 minutes ago, the unfamiliar voice was saying. Mr. DeLuca's instructions were clear. We wait for his call. This is the Blackthorn property, Richards said. His voice was controlled but carrying the particular strain of an older man trying to maintain dignity while understanding he was not in a position of authority in this conversation. It won't be for long. A pause. Mr. Adrian Blackthorn is not here, which is exactly why Mr. DeLuca chose this timing. The unfamiliar voice was not raised. It had the quality of someone explaining something obvious to someone slow. You can cooperate, or you can be in the way. Those are the 2 options. Harper breathed through her nose. DeLuca had moved faster than Adrian had anticipated. Or the surveillance had been cover. The real move had been inside the house, already inside, using the window between Adrian leaving and the tactical response being assembled. She counted what she knew, 1 voice, therefore probably not alone, position at the main landing, which meant the main entrance was controlled. She turned and went back down the corridor faster than she'd come up. Evelyn's rooms were at the far end of the east wing, away from the main stairs. She moved along the wall, past the closed doors of guest rooms, past the small sitting area at the corridor's midpoint, past the portrait of the gray mare that had taught her the route to the east sitting room on her 3rd week in the house, and she pushed open Evelyn's door without knocking. Evelyn was awake. She was sitting at the edge of her bed in her silk robe, upright, her hands in her lap, and she was looking at the door with an expression that told Harper she'd been aware something was wrong before Harper arrived. There were moments when the confusion receded entirely, when the real woman was entirely present, and this was one of them. Evelyn's eyes were clear and focused, and underneath the fear, resolute. Harper, her voice was low. There are men in the house. I know. Harper crossed to her. We need to go, right now. Can you walk? I'm not an invalid. No, you're not. Harper looked around the room. Robe, slippers, nothing else, no time. Can you move fast? How fast? Fast. Evelyn stood up from the bed. She was 71 years old, and she stood up from the bed with the deliberateness of someone choosing to be fully present in their own body, and Harper felt something in her chest that was not the time for a fierce, complicated love for this woman who had been kind to her in a house where kindness was rare, and who was standing up in her silk robe at 6 in the morning with DeLuca's people on the landing because she was, underneath everything, not someone who sat still when things came for her. "Service stairs," Harper said. "North entrance. Stay behind me." "Where's Adrian?" "Coming." Not a lie. A compression. He was coming. He was assembling his response. He was already moving toward this, but he was not here yet, and they needed to be gone before the men on the landing decided to stop waiting. They moved. The corridor was clear. Harper kept Evelyn close, one hand lightly at her elbow. Not guiding, not pulling, just present. The way she'd learned to be present in the moments when the terrain shifted unexpectedly. They reached the service door and Harper eased it open, and they went through, and she heard the main stairwell landing behind them. Voices again, movement, someone saying something about the matriarch, check her rooms, and she kept moving, down the service stairs. One flight. The landing at the bottom where the narrow door opened to the back passage. Harper pressed against the door and listened. Silence on the other side. She pushed it open. A man was standing in the back passage. He was large, dark-coated, and he registered her with the immediate sharp attention of someone doing a job. His eyes went from Harper to Evelyn, and his hand went to the inside of his coat. "Don't," Harper said. Her voice came out flat and certain, and she had no weapon and no leverage and no operational training whatsoever, and she was standing in a back passage of a house she cleaned for a living with a woman with dementia at her back and a man with a gun, considering his options, and she met his eyes and did not move. "Step away from her," the man said. "No." His jaw tightened. His hand was inside his coat, but not moving. "Vincent DeLuca is making a mistake," Harper said. The words arrived without her planning them. She was operating below planning now, in the region of instinct and blunt truth. Adrian Blackthorne knows everything, about the ring, about the compound, about the assassination attempt at the gala. She watched the man's face, the slight movement in his eyes, the registration of information he didn't have. The person who designed that ring made one mistake. They didn't count on someone stepping in the way. She kept her voice steady. That someone is me. And right now, the only thing standing between what happened tonight becoming public, courts, records, the kind of evidence that doesn't disappear, is how this moment goes. The man's hand was still. "Step aside," Harper said, "or don't. But you need to understand what you're deciding." 3 seconds. The back passage was very cold and very silent, and the man with his hand inside his coat looked at her with the particular expression of someone running a rapid cost-benefit calculation. And she stood in front of Evelyn and breathed and waited. He stepped aside. Harper moved. She had Evelyn through the service passage and out the north entrance door and onto the service road before her legs started shaking, and she walked through the shaking because the shaking was irrelevant, and she had the phone Moss had given her in her hand, and she called the number and said, "We're out, North Road." 2 minutes, Moss said. She stood on the service road with Evelyn beside her and the cold absolute around them and the sky beginning to separate into the dark gray of early morning, and Evelyn took her hand. Not the way you took someone's hand to be steadied, the way you took someone's hand because you chose to. "You came back," Evelyn said. "I said I would." "You didn't say that." "I thought it." Evelyn's hand was cool and dry, and its grip was very steady. She looked at Harper's face, the dressing, the bruising, with an expression that was clear and present and full of something that Harper had no framework for receiving gracefully, so she didn't try. She looked down the service road toward the sound of approaching headlights. Behind them, inside the estate, she heard it begin, the crack and reverberation of the world Adrian had built for 20 years, assembling itself into a weapon and bringing it to bear on the people who had believed that a maid who spilled trays and bumped into furniture was not worth accounting for. The headlights reached them. Moss was driving. He took one look at Harper's face and said nothing, which was the most professional thing she'd ever seen a person do. And he helped Evelyn into the car with a gentleness that surprised her. And Harper got in after, and the car moved. And behind them, as the estate walls receded in the rear window, Harper heard the first real sound of what was coming. Not gunfire, not yet, but the low-engineered silence that preceded it. The silence of a man who had spent his entire life building toward this moment, understanding with total precision what had been attempted, who had attempted it, and what the cost would be. She turned away from the window. Evelyn's hand was still in hers. The car moved through the early dark toward the secondary address, and somewhere behind them, Adrian Blackthorne walked through the front doors of his own estate for the first time in 9 hours and looked at the men Vincent DeLuca had left inside his home. And his face held an expression that the men in that house would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. And he said one word to Moss through the phone. One word, quiet and absolute as a door closing. And the word Adrian said into the phone was, now. Moss heard it through the speaker, and his foot pressed the accelerator by a fraction, and the car moved faster through the pre-dawn dark. And Harper heard it too because the phone was not held far enough from her. And she understood without needing explanation that the word was not the beginning of something. It was the completion of something that had been building for a long time before she ever walked through the service entrance of Blackthorne Estate with coffee on her shirt. She held Evelyn's hand and watched the road ahead and did not look back. What happened at Blackthorne Estate in the hours that followed was something Harper reconstructed afterward from pieces, from what Moss told her, from what Priya confirmed, from the things Adrian said and did not say in the days that came later. She was not there for it. She had been deliberately removed from it, which she understood was both tactical and something else, something she didn't have a clean word for yet. What she knew was this. Adrian walked into his own house at 6:14 in the morning and found 4 of Vincent DeLuca's men in his foyer, his study, and his kitchen, positioned with the confidence of people who believed they had chosen their moment correctly. They had surveillance on the main gate and a car blocking the service road and a direct line to Vincent himself, who was sitting in a hotel 12 miles away waiting for confirmation that the Blackthorne matriarch was secured and the estate was under DeLuca operational control. What Vincent did not have was an accurate picture of what Adrian had spent 9 hours assembling while Vincent was assembling his. The 4 men in the house were removed from it without violence, which was a deliberate choice on Adrian's part. Not mercy, but message. Violence would have been simpler and faster. Removing them intact, zip-tied in the back of 2 black vehicles, drove a different point. It said, I didn't need to hurt you, which means I could have. Which means your employer sent you into a situation he did not understand. The surveillance team at the main gate was handled by Moss's people before Adrian had finished with the interior. The car on the service road was already empty, its occupants having made a rapid assessment of the situation approximately 4 minutes after Harper and Evelyn walked past them, concluding that their operational window had closed in a way that warranted immediate relocation. By 7 in the morning, the estate was clean. By 8, Adrian had made 3 phone calls. The first was to the Blackthorne Syndicate's legal infrastructure, a network of attorneys and accountants who had been waiting for authorization to execute a series of financial maneuvers that had been prepared months in advance. Offshore accounts tied to DeLuca operations began to experience difficulties. Holding companies dissolved. Assets that had been structured through shell arrangements found their documentation suddenly and comprehensively submitted to 3 separate regulatory bodies. The second call was to a federal contact, a relationship built over years of careful cultivation, the kind of relationship that existed in the gray space between law enforcement and the people law enforcement could not touch directly, but sometimes needed to be pointed in a direction. The contact was given a specific piece of information about a synthetic neurotoxin and the name of a Miami victim who had never had his toxicology panel correctly interpreted. The contact understood the value of what he was being given. The third call was to Vincent DeLuca directly. Harper learned the content of that call from Priya, who had been in the room. Adrian told Vincent 3 things. First, that he had the ring, that he had the toxicology results, and that he had a sworn statement from a medical professional detailing the compound, its delivery mechanism, and its intended target. Second, that every piece of financial documentation connecting DeLuca operations to 17 distinct criminal enterprises had been submitted to regulatory authorities and would become active within 48 hours unless Adrian made a specific call to delay it, a call he was prepared to make on one condition. Third, that the condition was unconditional withdrawal. From the Blackthorne territory, from the Northern Distribution Corridor, from every arrangement and agreement and informal understanding that the DeLucas had accumulated over 20 years of proximity to the Blackthorne operation. Vincent said nothing for a long time. Then he said, You'd burn yourself too. Adrian said, I've already restructured, you haven't. Another silence. My daughter is alive, Adrian said. She's going to stay that way. That's more than you gave the people you sent that ring for. Vincent DeLuca was 63 years old and had built his organization from a street-level operation in Newark into a multi-state criminal enterprise through a combination of strategic intelligence and the willingness to do things that other people found too costly. He was not a man who surrendered easily or gracefully or without extracting some price in return. But he was also not a man who confused pride with survival. He said, I'll need time to 48 hours, Adrian said. Then the delay call either happens or it doesn't. He hung up. Harper learned all of this later. In the immediate aftermath, she was at the secondary address, a house in a quiet residential neighborhood, unremarkable from the outside, that turned out to contain 3 furnished bedrooms, a fully stocked kitchen, and 2 of Moss's people maintaining a perimeter with the casual thoroughness of people who'd done this before. She sat at the kitchen table with Evelyn across from her, both of them with tea that one of Moss's people had made without being asked, which Harper found oddly moving. Evelyn held her cup with both hands and looked at the window. The sky had gone from bruised gray to the pale washed light of early winter morning, flat and cold and honest. He'll win, Evelyn said. Harper looked at her. You sound certain. I've watched him for 34 years. A pause. He didn't get this way by losing. That's not the same as certainty. No. Evelyn set the cup down. She looked at Harper's face directly, fully, with the clarity of one of her present moments. What he is now, what he's become, I'm not always proud of it. I want you to know that. He knows it too. Her hands folded on the table, the knuckles pale. His father was harder, crueler. Adrian learned to be what he had to be inside something that left marks. A pause. But the marks don't go all the way through. That's what I've held on to. Harper thought about the conservatory floor, his hand over hers. Don't. He's not a good man, Harper said carefully. No, Evelyn agreed. But he's not only a bad one. Those two things are both true, and the space between them is where he actually lives. She looked at Harper steadily. You already know that. I can see that you know it. Harper looked at her tea. You're not a simple person either, Evelyn said. You walked into a room because you heard a frightened woman call out, and you stayed because... She stopped. Why did you stay, Harper? You could have reported it, to Aldridge, to the estate management. You could have made it someone else's responsibility. Harper was quiet for a moment. Because it was already mine. Evelyn looked at her for a long time. Yes, she said. That's exactly what I thought. Vincent DeLuca capitulated within 31 hours. He did not do it gracefully. He did it through intermediaries and legal instruments and a formal communication that used language carefully calibrated to avoid any phrasing that could be read as admission of wrongdoing. The financial documentation went into delay. The withdrawal of DeLuca presence from the Northern Corridor began as a series of operational adjustments that, viewed individually, looked like routine business decisions. Viewed collectively, they looked exactly like what they were. Isabella was not arrested. The evidence that Adrian held was sufficient to send her to trial, and both parties understood this, and both parties understood that a trial would destroy the DeLuca organization far more comprehensively than any private arrangement. The arrangement was this. Isabella DeLuca would not set foot in the state of New York. She would not contact any member of the Blackthorn organization. She would not conduct any financial or criminal operation within the territories that had been specified in the 48-hour ultimatum. She would spend the rest of her professional life in a significantly reduced operational geography, with the knowledge that a vial in a private medical facility held sufficient evidence to end her freedom at a moment's notice. Harper learned the terms of the arrangement the same way she learned most things about what had happened, in pieces, from Priya, in the kitchen of the secondary house, over the course of the 3 days she spent there while the estate was secured and cleared and returned to itself. She asked on the second day, "Is it enough? Just moving her out? After what would be enough?" Priya asked, not challenging, genuinely asking. Harper thought about it, about the ring, about Calloway's voice on the phone at 3 in the morning, about the conservatory, and Evelyn pressed against the wall, and the particular way Isabella had said for now, beautiful and hollow, and absolutely sure of herself. "I don't know," Harper said. "Something that lasts." "It lasts," Priya said. "Losing everything you built lasts. Watching it go and being unable to stop it lasts. Death would have been simpler." She poured more tea. "Adrian doesn't do simple." Calloway and his daughter were moved to a city Harper was never told the name of. Priya said they were safe. She said it with the specificity of someone reporting a verified fact rather than offering comfort, and Harper believed her. She thought about Calloway sometimes, about the 14 months of compromise and the one moment of clarity, about the choice he'd made when the results came back and the phone was in his hand. She didn't forgive it cleanly or condemn it cleanly because neither of those things was honest. He had operated inside an impossible pressure and had made bad choices and had, when it mattered most, made a different one. That was the full picture. She held the full picture. It was what she knew how to do. She returned to Blackthorn Estate on the 4th day. Not to her duties. She hadn't been formally reinstated, hadn't received any communication about her employment status, hadn't known until the car arrived at the secondary house at 10 in the morning with Moss in the driver's seat and Evelyn in the back, that she was going back at all. Evelyn had looked at her through the car window and said simply, "Come home." And that had been the entirety of the negotiation. The estate looked the same from the outside. Stone and iron and the frozen hills behind it, the sky above pressing low and gray with the particular quality of upstate New York winter that made everything feel provisional and permanent at the same time. The driveway was clear. The east gate stood open. She carried nothing because she had nothing at the secondary house to carry. The staff she passed in the entry hall looked at her differently. Not with warmth, exactly. Not yet. And maybe not the kind of warmth she might eventually want. And she was honest with herself about that want, which was new. Caroline met her eyes and didn't look away. Dex nodded once, brisk and professional. Mrs. Aldridge was nowhere visible, which Priya later told her was because Mrs. Aldridge had resigned that morning, citing a desire to pursue other opportunities, which was the language of a woman who had seen which way things had moved and made a practical decision. Harper walked through the entry hall and felt the house around her differently than she had for 3 months. Not as something she was inside on sufferance, not as something she navigated with her head down and her profile small, more like something that knew she was there. She wasn't naive enough to call it home yet, but she felt its dimensions around her without flinching from them, which was new. She was put in a recovery suite on the 2nd floor of the East Wing, not the staff quarters in the back. The 2nd floor of the East Wing, in a room with tall windows that looked over the winter garden, where the stripped rose canes made their dark architectural lines against the snow, and the old stone wall caught the flat light and held it. The room had a sitting area and a writing desk, and a bathroom with heated floors, and Harper stood in the middle of it for a full minute before she could move, because the room was a declaration that she didn't yet know how to receive. Priya brought her bags from her apartment, so not all of them, just the essentials, clothes, and her father's photograph, and the small accumulated objects of a life, without being asked. Harper didn't ask how Priya had known what to bring. She had stopped asking certain questions. She slept for 11 hours. She woke up to snow falling outside the tall windows, and her cheek aching with a steady, manageable authority, and she lay in the bed and looked at the ceiling and breathed. And for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure, there was nothing immediate pulling at her. Her father's treatment was paid for. She had received formal notification from Mercy General's billing office 2 days earlier. A full payment, account cleared, continuing treatment authorized and funded. She had read the notification 3 times. Then she had sat down on the floor of the secondary house kitchen because her legs had decided that was appropriate. She had not cried. She had sat on the floor and breathed through it, which was what she did. And then she had gotten up and gone to find Priya and said, carefully, "There's been a payment made to my father's hospital account." And Priya had said, "I know. He did it without telling me." "Yes. That's..." Harper had stopped, started again. "That's not something I can just accept without..." "You can talk to him about it," Priya had said. "That option exists." And she talked to him about it on the 5th day. He came to the recovery suite in the late afternoon when the light through the windows had gone the particular gold of winter sun through cloud, brief, specific, already beginning to fade. He knocked, which she noted. She told him to come in, and he came in and sat in the chair by the window without being invited to, which she also noted because it was the first time she'd seen him move through a space with something other than purposefulness. He sat down like a person who was tired in the ordinary human way, and he looked at the window rather than at her, and she let him have the moment. He was wearing dark trousers and a gray shirt, no jacket, and she could see the edge of a bruise along his right forearm that she hadn't seen before. The kind of bruise that came from physical confrontation, not operational management. She didn't ask about it. He would tell her what he wanted to tell her. "Your father," he said, still looking at the window. "I should have told you first." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He nodded, accepting it without defense. "Thank you," she said. "I need you to know I mean that, even though you should have told me first." He looked at her then. The winter light was on the side of his face, and in it he looked for a moment younger than he was, or more precisely, he looked like the age he was, which was 34, which was younger than the way he usually moved through rooms. The severity was still there. It was always there, and she suspected it would always be there, written into him too deeply to surface out. But underneath it, in this room, in this light, something was present that she had only seen in glimpses. "The staff payments," he said. "Priya tells me you've been supplementing the junior staff's wages from your own pay." She looked at him. "That's private information. Priya works for me." "Priya," Harper said, "has a very flexible understanding of what constitutes private." Something happened at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The closest approximation he had, and she was beginning to understand it was something he gave rarely enough that she should note when it appeared. "You were giving money away," he said, "while your father was—" "It was small amounts. The junior kitchen staff are underpaid. It was a minor correction to an unjust situation." She met his eyes. "Don't make it into something larger than it was." "It was larger than it was," he said, quietly. "That's the point." The room was very still. "I need to ask you something," Harper said, "and I need you to answer me honestly." "All right. What am I here?" "Now. In this room. On this floor." She looked at him steadily. "I'm not your employee anymore, clearly. I'm not a guest in the normal sense. I'm not—" She stopped. "I need to know what the situation is. Clearly. Not managed." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're the person I trust most in this house," he said, which is a thing I didn't expect to be true, and is true anyway. He didn't look away. "What happens with that is, I'm not going to manage that. I'm telling you the fact of it. What it means is something we'd have to decide." "That's not a clear answer." "No," he said. "It's not." "Adrian?" "Harper." His voice was level, and it held the weight of the 5 days and the conservatory floor, and the phone call at 3 in the morning, and the car on the service road, and the word he'd said into the phone that had ended the DeLuca operation, and every compressed, operational, carefully managed interaction between them since September. All of it was in the way he said her name, not the way he'd said it in the conservatory, directing her, but the way a person said a word they'd been turning over long enough that it had worn smooth. "I know what the situation is. I know what I want it to be. I'm not going to tell you what you should want. That's not something I'm willing to do." She held his gaze. "Your world is dangerous," she said. "Yes. The things you're involved in." "I know what I am," he said. "I'm not asking you to pretend otherwise. I'm not a pretending person. I know." The faintest thread of something in his voice. That's the entire problem. Outside the windows, the snow had deepened. It fell without urgency, thick and steady, covering the winter garden and the rose canes and the old stone wall, filling in the hard angles of the estate's exterior until everything was softened and simplified, and the light was the particular blue-white of winter dusk that made the world look clean in a way that was temporary and real simultaneously. Harper looked at him. She thought about her father's hospital room on bad nights, the sound of the monitors, the nurse with the good hands who had taught her that calmness was a skill and not a disposition. She thought about the east sitting room and the wrong turn and the sound of a frightened woman calling a name into an empty room and the choice she'd made to push the door open. She thought about 3 months of spilled trays and broken glass and the small daily weight of being nobody in a place built to make certain people feel like nobody. And she thought about the conservatory floor and the white explosion of pain and the blood through her fingers and his hand over hers, pressing it back. She thought about all of it as a sequence, not as a series of accidents. "My father needs to meet you," she said. Something shifted in his face, something that opened slightly, carefully, like a thing that hadn't been opened in a long time and was testing the hinges. "When he's well enough," she continued, "he'll need to understand who you are, what the situation is. He'll have opinions. I'd expect that. He's not going to be easy about it. I'd also expect that. And I'm going to keep working," she said, "not as a maid. Something real, something that uses what I actually am. I won't sit in a room and be kept." "I know you won't," he said, and the way he said it told her that this was not a concession. It was a statement of what he had already understood about her, which meant he had been paying attention long enough and carefully enough that she was now in the position of receiving a version of herself reflected back at full resolution. That was its own kind of disorienting. "Okay," she said. He looked at her. "Okay. Don't make a thing of it." He didn't. He looked at the window, at the snow, at the fading winter light, and she looked at it too, and they sat in the same room with the same silence, and it had a texture that was entirely different from any silence she'd sat in before. Not empty, not charged, not the silence of a power imbalance or a managed interaction or two people performing composure for different audiences. Just the silence of two people who had been through something and had arrived on the other side of it and were, for the first time, in the same place at the same time without either of them managing the distance. The snow kept falling. The gold light ran out. In the blue dusk, the estate settled into its winter quiet, and somewhere on the 4th floor of Mercy General Hospital, a man named Gerald Quinn slept in a clean bed with his treatment scheduled for the following morning. And somewhere in a city, Harper would never be told the name of a doctor, and his daughter ate dinner at a kitchen table and did not speak about what they had come from. And somewhere in the reduced geography of her remaining life, Isabella DeLuca sat with the specific knowledge of what it costs to underestimate a person you had decided was beneath your notice. And in a recovery suite on the 2nd floor of the East Wing, with the tall windows full of winter and the heated floor warm under her feet, Harper Quinn sat across from the most dangerous man in New York and felt, with a clarity that required no management and no compression and no shrinking to fit the available space, that she was exactly where she had chosen to be, not where circumstance had put her, not where someone else's plan had required her to be, where she had walked, on her own feet, by the accumulation of choices she had made with full knowledge of what they cost. The ring had cut her face. The poison had entered her blood. She had been on her knees on a marble floor in a house full of people who had decided she was no one. She was not on her knees now. She had not been nobody. She had been, from the first wrong turn down the wrong corridor, exactly who she was. A woman who pushed doors open when she heard something frightened on the other side, who held people steady when the ground moved under them, who stepped in front of things that were coming too fast for anyone else to move. That was not a strategy. It was not a calculation. It was not the performance of a quality in pursuit of a reward. It was her, and it had been enough. It had been, in the end, everything. The snow kept falling on Blackthorn Estate, steady and indifferent and clean, covering the driveway and the gardens and the old stone walls, filling in all the hard places until nothing looked sharp anymore. And inside, in the warmth and the quiet, Harper Quinn was finally, completely, and irrevocably seen.